Hey, it's Josh here with the Manchise, and this year I plan on providing you guys with some content for the upcoming EPL season. I'm going to focus on the draft format of Fantasy EPL, and in today's video I'll be going over my forward rankings. So in the first round, if you're looking to draft a forward, I think there's only two forwards worth considering. One would be Harry Kane from Tottenham, and the other would be Erling Haaland from Man City. Now, I went back and forth on who I would consider to be number one in my rankings. And initially, I had Erling Haaland as number one in my rankings. And some of that could be because I'm a Man City fan, so naturally I'm biased. But ultimately, I had to weigh out, what do I value more, the upside of taking a guy like Erling Haaland or the certainty of drafting a player like Harry Kane. And I think what it comes down to is that we already know that Harry Kane has produced in this system. He already has a relationship and playing experience with guys like Son and Kulusevski. And he's done it. He's been a proven player in the Premier League. So ultimately, I think that's why he ended up number one in my rankings. Now, with that being said, if you're looking to hit a home run with your first round pick and take the guy with probably the most upside outside of Salah, then Erling Haaland's going to be that guy. We know that Man City is going to score a ton of goals this season. And Haaland should play a ton of minutes. He really is the only primary striker on the team. We might see Alvarez accumulate some minutes. But at the end of the season, if you asked me who is going to lead the Premier League in goals outside of Salah, it's probably going to be Haaland. And if there's anyone that's going to contend with Salah, it would potentially be Haaland. My concerns, though, is that it may take him a few matches to get into form and to get used to and adjusted to playing in the Premier League. Whereas with Harry Kane, as I mentioned, I think starting from the very first game week, he's going to be pretty productive. So I think Harry Kane's definitely the safer play between the two options. And like I said, on draft day, if you're looking to take a forward in the first round and those two guys are on the board, you really can't go wrong. But you probably just want to weigh out, is it worth taking a gamble on the upside of Haaland, or are you going to feel a little bit safer with Harry Kane? So once you get past Harry Kane and Erling Haaland, in the second round, that's where you can start to look to take some of these other forwards. So the next tier of forwards that I have in my rankings would be Jesus, Vardy, Nunez, and Jota. And I do truly like Jesus as the third best forward in my rankings. If you look at the default rankings on the draft.premierleague.com website, you'll see Jesus isn't as highly ranked as I have him here. But let's be real, the guy's been on fire in the preseason. He scored 7 goals so far. It looks like he's going to gel very nicely with Saka and Martinelli. And again, this is one where I don't think he's going to be contested too much for minutes. So as long as he stays fit, I expect him to, play a ton of matches and produce a lot of goals. To be honest, I like Arsenal as a sleeper team this season. Obviously you have Man City and Liverpool. Those two clubs are probably going to be at the top of the table. But beyond Man City and Liverpool, it wouldn't surprise me if Arsenal ended up third in the standings at the end of the season. So I absolutely love Jesus this year. And in all the mock drafts and drafts that I've done, I've been targeting him in the second round. If it's an 8-team league, and the top guys are off the board, right? So Salah, Son, Kane, Haaland, De Bruyne are off the board. You could argue that Jesus is a guy that you could reach for in the first round, especially with the way he's been playing this preseason and the form that he's in. Now, what was difficult for me was to decide who would be fourth in my rankings. And most people are probably going to have one of the forwards from Liverpool or even Ronaldo from Man U as fourth in their rankings. But again, it's just hard for me to ignore how safe of a play Jamie Vardy is, right? As long as Jamie Vardy is healthy, he is the number one option for Leicester. And I know he's getting older, but we haven't really seen any signs of him slowing down. So I really like Jamie Vardy again this season. If you don't end up taking a forward in the first round, so you don't end up with Kane, you don't end up with Haaland, maybe someone reaches for Jesus, I just think Vardy is a safe option. He's a guy that you'll be able to plug and play into your lineups each game week, and he's going to put up numbers. Again, as long as he stays healthy. But that, you can make that case with just about anybody in the Premier League. So after Vardy, I have the two Liverpool forwards in Nunez and Jota. And right now, I just have Nunez ranked a little bit higher than Jota because Jota's banged up and he might miss some time, at least to start the season. He hasn't really played much in the preseason. Now, the one thing that I will say about Jota is he has experience playing with Salah. And he played with Luis Diaz last season a little bit as well towards the end of the season, which is nice. But as I mentioned, he's banged up. It might take him a while to get into form. He might not even play the first week or two. And it's just difficult for me to use such a high draft pick on a guy that's not going to be coming into the season, 100% healthy. And Nunez, from what it looks like, is going to slot in very nicely with Liverpool. They play that 4-3-3, and it looks like Diaz is going to start out wide on the left, Salah is going to start out wide in the right, and then bring in a guy like Nunez to just slot in as a striker. He's going to get a ton of opportunities and a ton of chances. The other thing is, I'm not too concerned with him not getting too much play time. I've seen other analysts talk about how Firmino might be the guy that gets the majority of the minutes early on in the season for Liverpool, at least at that number 9 position. And that may be the case for the first game week or so. But, they're very different style players. Again, they spent a ton of money on Nunez, so they're going to definitely want to get him on the pitch. And as I mentioned, Nunez at this point is just a better goal-scoring striker at this point in his career, comparatively to Bobby Firmino. Firmino's a guy that's, you can press with Firmino. He's got good hold-up play, but he's getting older. And we've seen him decline now over the past couple seasons. He's had trouble staying healthy. He hasn't put up the same numbers as he's put up in the past. And just in my opinion, Firmino's not a guy that is a top-level striker in the Premier League at this point in his career. And I think there's a huge opportunity for Nunez to take over and put up, some really big numbers for Liverpool this season. So after Nunez and Jota, then I have Cristiano Ronaldo. And Cristiano Ronaldo is probably the most difficult forward to rank this season, right? Because he's already come out, and it sounds like he doesn't really have a desire to play for Man U. And I don't blame him. I don't think Man U is going to be very good this year. I think they're kind of in a rebuilding phase. But unfortunately, because of Ronaldo's age and because of Ronaldo's salary, it didn't seem like there were too many takers for him in this summer's transfer market. So a couple things with Ronaldo being ranked a little bit lower than you might expect him to see. The first being is, again, he hasn't really been with the team, Man U, too much this season. He's not in form. He's out of shape. I don't expect him to start or get too much playing time at all. Probably until like the 4th or 5th game week, and that would be at the very earliest. So if you're going to draft a guy like Ronaldo, you're probably not going to get too much production out of him until like September, to be honest. And the second thing is, the transfer window hasn't closed yet. I don't think anyone's going to, approach Man U to buy a guy like Cristiano Ronaldo, but it's not out of the possibility. And again, that's just that initial summer transfer window, right? So if things really go south for Manchester United, if it doesn't look like they're going to qualify for Champions League or even the Europa League, I wouldn't be surprised come winter if Ronaldo tries to force his way out of Manchester. So he's kind of the ultimate gamble when doing a fantasy draft this year because he has such upside. Ronaldo's one of the best players in the world, and he's going to produce when he's on the pitch. But between the concerns of his availability early on in the season, and then also the possibility that he could eventually get transferred to another club, it's just hard for me to put him ahead of guys like Vardy and ahead of the Liverpool forwards in Jota and Nunez. So after Ronaldo, I would say there's a pretty big decline in regards to what you would potentially get from the forwards that you're drafting in this next tier. So right now, the way that I have it is I have Kai Havertz right after Ronaldo, then Ivan Toney, and Callum Wilson. Starting off with Havertz, he's kind of a tricky one to rank. He's a forward. He's a center forward, but he's not a traditional striker, right? So, and honestly, watching Chelsea play in the preseason, depending on if they go 3-back with the wing backs for their formation, or if they do a more traditional 2 center back and then your outside backs, that's going to have an impact, I think, on where Havertz ultimately ends up playing within the formation. I think when they go to the 3-back, Sterling is going to be the main forward for Chelsea, and then you'll have Havertz and Mount in more of those attacking midfielder roles. But if they play in a formation that's the traditional 2 center backs, and then probably Reece would be a right back and Chilwell as a left back, then that could be very different. You could see Sterling and Mount on the wings, and Havertz would end up in that forward striker position. So this one's just a little bit, Havertz, like I said, is a little bit difficult to rank simply because he isn't really a traditional forward. I don't think he's going to have as many goal-scoring opportunities, but hey, he should rack up assists, and he played pretty well for Chelsea. The other thing with Havertz being ranked a little bit lower here, like below Ronaldo, just has to do with Chelsea. They have a new manager this year. They have a ton of new pieces. They don't look to be as solid defensively. And I think Chelsea could struggle a little bit to begin the season. They've struggled a bit in preseason. It's not that they haven't won their matches, but they've been giving up a ton of goals. I know that doesn't have an impact on, Havertz's performance or the forwards' performance for any of the forwards that are on Chelsea's team. But again, it's just something to be concerned with, because if Chelsea struggles to have success early on in the season, then they might make adjustments to how they're setting up their formations, and they also might make adjustments with who's starting on a week-to-week basis. They do have a pretty deep bench. They have Broha, they have Pulisic, they have Hudson-Odoi. So there's some guys there that could easily be rotated in, and that could impact how many minutes Havertz ultimately gets. With Ivan Toney, he's going to see the bulk of the minutes for Brentford, but he plays for Brentford, right? And if you're looking at the other screen or the other window in this video, you can see the offensive ratings for each team and the expected goal differential. Now, this is all being populated. These projections are being populated by 538. So, take that with a grain of salt, but I think they do a pretty good job. And I just don't expect Brentford to be like an offensive juggernaut. Despite that, like I said, Ivan Toney's going to play a ton of minutes, and he's going to get some goal-scoring opportunities. I think last year he scored like 12 or 13 goals. Let me just pull it up here. Tony scored 12 goals last year, and I would expect similar production this season for Ivan Toney. So he's just a solid guy that you can play ideally as a second forward if you're going to roll out a formation with two forwards. After Ivan Toney is Callum Wilson. Now, Callum Wilson, the problem with him has always just been his health, right? Like every season he misses a ton of time. He's productive when he's on the pitch, but he isn't always on the pitch, and that's a big issue. The other thing that I'll say with Callum Wilson is Newcastle, with all the funding that they've had, they've really added some talent to that team, and Newcastle could be a surprise this year. And again, looking at 538's projections, offensively they're rated 1.8, so they're actually slightly below Brentford. Though the goal differential projections are exactly the same. It wouldn't shock me if at the end of the year Newcastle scored more goals than Brentford. I just think they have more talent, with Trippier and Guimaraes, and now they have Nick Pope in goal. I just think they're going to be a more competitive team than Brentford this season. So beyond Callum Wilson, I think this is where you start to get into the tier where you're going to start to look for guys with a lot of upside. So the way that I have it ranked right now is I have Dominic Calvert-Lewin, Ollie Watkins, Richarlison, and Julian Alvarez. And I think you could tier those guys together. We'll start off with Calvert-Lewin. He's kind of in a similar situation as Ivan Toney. As far as he's going to be on the pitch a ton as long as he's healthy, and he's going to be the main primary goal scorer. He's going to have a ton of opportunities. Well, he's not going to have a ton of opportunities, but the opportunities that Everton does have to score this year, you would assume that Dominic Calvert-Lewin is going to be involved. And Dominic Calvert-Lewin last year missed a ton of time. He was banged up, but the season before that, he had a really good season. He started off very hot, and it just never carried over to last year's season, and I think a lot of that just had to do with his health. But when he's on the pitch, he's going to produce. The reason why I don't have him higher up in the rankings is simply because I don't expect Everton to be very good this year. Everton sold off Richarlison. They have some good young players in like Gordon. We'll see if Iwobi can ever turn into something. But I just don't see Dominic Calvert-Lewin having a highly skilled supporting cast. And like I said, that's going to limit his opportunities with Everton. Beyond Dominic Calvert-Lewin, I have Ollie Watkins. Ollie Watkins is in a similar situation as Dominic Calvert-Lewin from a standpoint that, when he's on the pitch, he produces. He's going to probably be playing in that number 9 role. And again, Ollie Watkins 2 seasons ago really came out of nowhere to produce good fantasy numbers. And last year, his production took a hit. Now, a big reason as to why his production took a hit, well, one, Aston Villa last year wasn't as good as they were the year prior. And then 2, they brought in Danny Ings last year, and Ings got a decent amount of playing time. With Aston Villa, again, this is a tough one because I don't really know from a week-to-week standpoint how they're going to line up. Last year, they played a lot of 2-striker formations with Ings and Watkins up front, but then they would also play a 4-3-3, and sometimes Watkins played as the primary forward, and then other times he played out on the wing. It's nice to see that he has that versatility because it just means that he's going to be on the pitch more. But Aston Villa has a ton of attacking options, right? So they have Watkins, they have Ings, they have Leon Bailey, they have Buendia, and we don't really know how Gerrard is going to approach this upcoming season, not only from a formation standpoint, but also as to, who's going to get a bulk of the playing time. I think it's going to be Ollie Watkins. I'm very down on Danny Ings this year. But that's why he's in the tier of the rankings that we're seeing him at on my list here. So, and then after Ollie Watkins is Richarlison. Now, Richarlison is kind of in a similar situation as a guy like Ronaldo, where he's like the ultimate boom or bust player that you could draft this season. Now, Richarlison has had Premier League success with Everton, and he's a guy that's always been in the double digits when scoring goals, and he's also been really good at an international stage for Brazil as well. But the problem with Richarlison is he doesn't really have a defined role for Tottenham at this point, right? We know that Tottenham is going to have Kane as their striker and Son as a winger, and Kulusevski was just so good last year that he's going to start for Tottenham this year. And Richarlison's suspended for game week 1. So you're not going to get any production from him for that very first game week. But Richarlison's very skilled, and if he does see the pitch, I would love to see how productive he could potentially be playing with Harry Kane and Heung-min Son. He's never had that type of talent around him before when he played for Everton. So this is a guy where, if Kulusevski doesn't carry over his success from last season and struggles early, I wouldn't be surprised if at some point Conte makes the switch and puts Richarlison in that starting lineup, and he could take off. So, this is a guy that I wouldn't be comfortable targeting early, but if he's hanging around in those middle rounds, he's worth taking a gamble on. Again, the nice thing is in fantasy soccer, you can control the formations that you're rolling out on a week-to-week basis. And, you don't have to have 2 or 3 forwards in your starting formation. So you can draft Richarlison as your second or third forward and just kind of sit him on the bench until he eventually cracks that starting lineup. Hopefully he does if, you have a guy like Richarlison on your team. And even if he doesn't crack the starting lineup, he's going to be the first option off the bench. And Tottenham's projected to be a very good offense this season. As you can see, they're 4th according to 538. They're ranked 2.4 with a plus 21 goal differential. So it's never a bad idea to have those guys on your team. And then after Richarlison's Julian Alvarez. Now, I think I'm a little bit higher on Alvarez than other analysts may be. And again, that's just a result of me being a Man City fan. But on top of that, Man City lost Sterling. They lost Jesus. Riyad Mahrez is only getting older. And I know he's been super productive, but what I'm trying to get at is there is a spot in the rotation for Julian Alvarez. We know Erling Haaland's going to be their primary striker. But if any injury occurs to Haaland, or, like we all know, Pep likes to rotate his squad on weeks where maybe they're playing weaker competition, teams like Fulham, they might decide to roll out Alvarez as the starting number 9. So in that case, just playing with the talent that he'll be surrounded by with Man City, there's a lot of upside there. And the other thing is, behind Mahrez in that right wing spot, I know Foden has been getting a lot of practice playing on the right side, but Alvarez also has experience playing as a right winger. So even in scenarios where Haaland is going to be on a pitch, there's a path for Alvarez to be on the pitch with Haaland. And that could lead to, a lot of production, a lot of goals, and potentially a lot of assists. Which the next tier contains either guys with some upside but are in situations where they could potentially split time, or guys that are going to be the number 1 option at the forward position on their clubs, but are just not going to be on very good teams. Right? So we have Antonio, Alexander Mitrovic, Gianluca Scamacca, and Patrick Bamford. We'll start off with Antonio. He started off last season so hot, right out of the gate. He was a guy that you wanted in your lineup if you were playing the traditional fantasy Premier League style. And then things just kind of slowed down from there. And I think part of that had to do with Antonio, but another part of that just had to do with West Ham. They were just firing right out of the gate at the beginning of last season. And it seemed like Antonio and Bowen had a really strong connection. And then that ultimately kind of withered away, and I'm starting to see glimpses of that right now. And again, in the preseason, you have to take the preseason performances with a grain of salt, but West Ham is just struggling to score goals. Looking at 538's projections, they have an offensive rating of 1.9, which is below teams such as Brighton and Leicester. It's right on par with Brentford, and that's pretty alarming to me. And then the second thing that's alarming is that West Ham spent money and went out and got Gianluca Scamacca, who's a young talent at the striker position. Now, I think Antonio is going to be the main striker there, at least at the very beginning of the season. And that's because Scamacca is coming from, Serie A, and it's just a different level of physicality and skill in the Premier League than what Serie A really has to offer. I mean, you have your top tier teams like Juventus and AC Milan and Inter, but as a whole, that league just isn't nearly as deep as the Premier League. So I think there is going to be a pretty big adjustment for a young player like Scamacca to have success. And because Antonio has just been rooted in that West Ham system, has played with Bowen, has played with Lanzini and some of the other talented guys that they have in West Ham, I think he's going to get the majority of the run, at least initially in the season. But again, Antonio is a guy that's not getting any younger, and he's proven throughout the previous seasons that he has a tendency to slow down. So that's why I have him a little bit lower in my rankings. For Alexander Mitrovic, this is a guy that scored 43 goals last year for Fulham in the Championship. That production's insane, and obviously that's not going to carry over to the Premier League. But he's the main guy for Fulham, and their offense is centered around him. So again, this is a guy that I like to have as like a third striker on my teams, especially if my second striker is more so an upside striker or forward like Richarlison, or even a guy like Anthony Martial, because that in a pinch, if you need someone to put in your lineup, the bare minimum, Mitrovic is going to start as long as he's healthy. And when Fulham plays weaker competition like Bournemouth or Everton or Nottingham Forest, he has the opportunity to produce. The only concern that I have with Mitrovic is we've seen him in the Premier League in the past, and at one point Mitrovic was considered like a top, like a wonder kid, and he never really got it together. So, there's some upside with having a guy like Mitrovic on your team, but he's not someone that I would want to rely on, Starting week to week. We've talked a little bit about Scamacca, and then beyond Scamacca would be Patrick Bamford. Bamford did not have a good season last year. Leeds was just absolutely dreadful last year. I'm pretty much trying to stay away from players that play for Leeds. And I think they're going to be even worse this year. They lost Raphinha. He's now playing for Barcelona. So there's just less talent going to be around Bamford. But, 2 seasons ago, he was highly productive. He's going to be the main guy in the forward position for Leeds. So, maybe he can regain some of that magic that he had 2 seasons ago. But it's not something that I'm banking on. Beyond Bamford, we have Raul Jimenez, Roberto Firmino, Danny Welbeck. These are all veterans that have played in the Premier League now for quite a while. We'll start off with Jimenez. Jimenez would certainly be higher up in my rankings if it wasn't for the knee injury that he sustained. So I wouldn't expect him to be back till sometime towards the middle of September, even maybe towards the end of September. So again, that coupled with him playing for Wolves, who Wolves aren't really the most dynamic offensive team, just has me a little bit down on Jimenez this year. Not a guy that I'm targeting in fantasy drafts at all. And then Roberto Firmino, we talked about him a little bit when we were discussing Darwin Nunez and Diogo Jota. I just think he's, at the end of the day, going to end up being third in that pecking order. And what might end up happening is, Jota has experience playing on the left wing, so it might end up being Jota on the left wing, Nunez as the striker, and Salah on the right wing. But even in that scenario, I wouldn't expect Firmino to be the first off the bench, because that would mean that Diaz would be the guy coming off the bench. So, Liverpool has a lot of talent, and I just think out of that group of forwards and wingers that I just pointed out, Firmino at this point in his career is probably going to be the least productive from a fantasy standpoint. Now, he's a guy that I wouldn't completely avoid because, Jota's already not going to be ready for the start of the season, and they're really only just one or two injuries away from Firmino having a full-time role, and he has a track record of being productive in the Premier League. So he's a guy that you can draft as like your third striker, but he's ranked entirely too high on the Fantasy Premier League default rankings, and in a lot of drafts he's going much earlier than he should. And then Danny Welbeck, he's probably at this point option A for Brighton. Again, Brighton has a 1.9 offensive ranking here, which is not too bad. It's pretty average. So Welbeck, I think, is a guy that's being overlooked this year. I'm not saying he's going to go out and score 15 goals for Brighton, but he could get a decent amount of playing time and have somewhere around 8, 9, who knows, maybe even 10 goals. And I think he's option A at this point for Brighton. So beyond Welbeck, we have Che Adams, Timo Werner, and then the two forwards from Nottingham Forest, which would be Brennan Johnson and Taiwo Awoniyi. I always have trouble pronouncing his name. At this point, you're just looking for guys that could potentially have some upside. Adams should be the main guy for Southampton over Armstrong. Armstrong just did not play well at all last year. I think they had some high hopes for him because he had played really well in the Championship, and it just didn't carry over into the Premier League. So Adams is a guy that might get you 7, 8, 9 goals this season. Not a ton of upside there. I just don't think Southampton's going to be very good, and 538 doesn't project him to be very good either. Timo Werner, it wouldn't surprise me if he ended the season elsewhere. I could see him going back to Germany. Maybe Leipzig would like to bring him back. He just doesn't have a role at this point for Chelsea. As I mentioned, Chelsea's one of those weird clubs where we don't know exactly how they're going to line up each week from a formation standpoint. So there's going to be game weeks where they might not even have a traditional striker out on the pitch, and if they do, it's either going to be Havertz or Sterling. And then like I said, Timo Werner doesn't really have a role. He would be third in the pecking order, and who knows, that he could end up being fourth in the pecking order behind Armando Broja. Broja played really good for Southampton last year. I wouldn't say played really good, but he showed signs of promise. And, with all of that information, there's a little bit of upside with having a guy like Werner, because you never know what could happen if he ends up getting some run for Chelsea. We know Chelsea are going to score goals. I just don't see a path for that at this moment. And then beyond Timo Werner, you have Brennan Johnson, you have Taiwo Awoniyi. Those guys have a little bit of upside. Brennan Johnson played pretty well as a young player for Nottingham in the championship last season. And then Taiwo came over from the Bundesliga, and I believe he scored like 15 or 16 goals there. So, little bit of upside there, but the problem is trying to figure out who's going to be the most productive forward for Nottingham. And I would expect that both of those guys do end up playing together, but at this point they're just not guys that I would really be targeting, but guys you probably want to keep your eye on. And then from there, the rest of this is really going to either be high upside guys on bad teams, or older players that just don't have a ton of upside, right? So we have Brian Mbemo, Odsonne Edouard, Danny Ings, Dominic Solanke, Patson Daka. A lot of these guys are either young players on bad teams that have a path to seeing the pitch, and they could potentially score some goals, or they're your grizzled veterans like Danny Ings and Chris Wood that are probably second in the forward rotation for their respective clubs. And if something were to happen to the guys ahead of them, such as Ollie Watkins for Aston Villa, then Danny Ings would slot in nicely there, and he's produced in the past in the Premier League. But Ings is only getting older. He didn't really play well last season, so I don't think there's a ton of upside there. I do want to talk about one of these guys though, and actually two of them. We'll start off with Edouard with Crystal Palace. So I have no idea come game week 1 how Crystal Palace is going to line up and who's going to play the forward position, who's going to play out on the wings. Like, we know Zaha is going to be the primary attacking option for them. But, is Edouard going to be on the field? Is it going to be Mateta? We don't know. And in the preseason, we're not really getting a great glimpse either because they're rotating those guys. But Edward's a guy to just keep an eye on, because if he does get a majority of the minutes for Palace and he's playing in tandem with Zaha, there's potential there for him to produce. And then Daka I want to talk about, just because when Vardy was hurt last season, and they brought in Daka during the winter transfer period, he had some success. In fact, I just want to bring up what his stats were here. Let's just take a look. So Daka scored 5 goals, and he only started in 13 games. So that's a lot of production. And if Vardy goes down and gets hurt this year, or as I mentioned, Vardy's not getting any younger. If he starts to slow down, I think Daka has some upside. So he's a guy that I'm not getting to in a lot of drafts, but someone that I want to keep my eye on throughout the season, because if Vardy gets hurt, he's a guy that I'm going to look at potentially picking up, because I think there's some upside there. Just the other concern with him is Leicester. I think Leicester probably takes a step back. Now, 538 has them with a 2.0 offensive ranking here, -2 goal differential. Leicester, who knows where they end up at the end of the season as far as their placement in the table. They could be top 7, and it wouldn't surprise me too much, or they could end up, 14 or 13, somewhere in there. They struggled last year. They're probably going to lose Schmeichel. They're probably going to lose Fofana. They could even lose Tielemans. So You know, there's some upside there with Daka, but again, you know, just one of those wait and see approaches with him. So that just about concludes my fantasy rankings for the upcoming fantasy season. So we talked about some of the guys that I am targeting in drafts, some of the guys that I'm avoiding, and hopefully this information helps you. I'm going to be making a video on the midfielders, the defenders, and goalkeepers as well. So if you liked this video and you thought that this was solid analysis, certainly give it a like, and then subscribe to the Manchise channel.